Welcome to the Radically Genuine Podcast. I am Dr. Roger McFillin, flying solo today. No guest, so it's an opportunity for me to share my thoughts on some things that are what appear to be new in the world of mental health from a government perspective. Recently, there was a summit, a mental health summit, that concluded with HHS Secretary Bobby Kennedy discussing some priorities, most focused on non-pharmacological approaches and an understanding of the psychiatric drug dependence crises that exist in the United States, with an emphasis on creating the systems, including the financial incentives, to get people off these drugs and get people off these drugs safely with hyperbolic tapering protocols and overall just being aware of the over-medicalization crisis that exists in the United States. So I had to think deeply about whether we are moving in the right direction. And what I've seen over the past couple months, and I fully accept that this could be my algorithm, is that this is getting pushed out into the matrix. It's getting pushed out in the social media sphere where people are now acknowledging how harmful SSRIs are, for example. And the United States as a population is becoming certainly more cognizant of the harms of pharmaceuticals and vaccines in general. And I was reflecting today, as I am currently writing a book, hopefully to be published later in the summer, that is shining the light on some of this darkness, but it's also a hopeful approach where I'm talking about becoming the light itself and how people actually heal and overcome the emotional challenges that are so consistent with the human experience. And it's a reflection on how we medicalized our suffering, the emotional pain of living, and we turn them into diseases. And I was aware of a quote by a gentleman by the name of Henry Gatson, who was a CEO of Merck, and he said it out loud in Fortune magazine in 1976. He actually was celebrated for this, a profile of a successful businessman with an ambitious vision. And the statement he said was, "It had long been my dream to make drugs for healthy people, to sell it to everyone." And this reflects the very clear financial incentives of pharmaceutical executives to be able to expand their market, right? If you're just dealing with people who are suffering from a particular disease and you're trying to create a synthetic chemical that in some way manages the disease, you're clearly incentivized by sick people. And what we have seen over the past 40, 50 years, in my opinion, which is a direct target on the American people, is we've been poisoned. We've been poisoned in the food system. We've been poisoned through media. We've been poisoned through drugs. And we have a sicker population because of it. Now, what does this mean? For me, I reflect on that summit. I was able to tune into some of it. And what you see is the incredible testimonies of people who've been harmed by psychiatric drugs and over-medicalization. And then the bureaucrats come to stage, those from NIMH, HHS, SAMHSA, and they're still saying the same thing that has always been said over the course of my lifetime, which is there is responsible psychiatric drug prescribing. There are people who benefit from it. And we just accept that as if it's true. Everyone starts nodding the head. Yes, of course. There are people who benefit from them. We're just over prescribing these drugs. And so I've always asked a question, well, who is benefiting from it? And based on what evidence? And this has been the Radically Genuine podcast in a lot of my platform up to this point, is to say, no, this doesn't exist. We do not have a healthier population. No, we have not decreased the burden of mental illness. No, we don't have these drugs that target a made-up condition called major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder or anything like this. We're just drugging symptoms of many other problems. So the book that I am writing, which is titled The Awakening They Cannot Medicate, which will be released by Balboa Press, I'm going to walk you through one of the chapters that I was writing. And it's titled The Human Experience is Not a Disease. And that sentence is the title, and I mean every word of that. Sadness is not a disease. Grief is not a disease. Fear, anger, restlessness, despair, the full range of what you feel when you are alive, it's not a disease. Now, that does not in any way dismiss real suffering and how people respond to their environments or the horrific things that can happen to people in this life. These are all real. It's just not a medical disease, and it never was, which is why we don't have any medical tests for it. We just prescribe pharmaceuticals, which blunt the life force within you. And that life force is the energy that is supposed to move. I do believe it's deliberate, not necessarily in some conspiratorial way. I think it's a very elaborate interconnection of many forces. Some of them, which I've talked about, have been intelligent forces, which are very much interested in mind control aspects, the use of drugs. How do you create a population that is more compliant? And again, the industry intersects with all of this, from the medical system, psychiatric care, the insurance-based system, you name it. But these are weapons, I think, of war. And I was reflecting back on my life and some inflection points over the course of my life. And someone like me is interesting because I'm going to be 50 years old this summer. I graduated high school in 1994. And this seems like a critical shift in American culture. And it requires someone like me who's been in it, who saw the shift in trying to create the emotional states of human beings into a market where you go see your doctor and you walk out with a prescription. It is I think, the foundation of moving from these drugs coming to market in the late 1980s into the 1990s, and then with direct to consumer advertising being pushed on the American public in 1997. See, at this time, the diagnostic manuals existed. Actually, the DSM-4 was published that year. They already had all these categories. They'd been written, negotiated in committee rooms, handed to the profession with the same absence of evidence that had characterized it every edition before. The DSM was never a manual of science. All it was descriptive natures of symptom clusters on why people would seek out professional help. So it can be coded and it could be billed for. But what started to happen, after this period of time, was it started to seep into the collective consciousness in a different kind of way. Because in 1994, when I was a senior in high school, it had not yet reached the living room or the school hallway or the television set. Like, the full range of human emotions was still understood to be a normal process of life. You felt what you felt, you moved through it. The people around you had versions of it too. And most of them had survived without a diagnosis or a prescription. And therapists existed at that time. People saw them, but therapy was not something that was as standard today. I mean, it was a resource for people who were navigating some difficulties. It certainly was not a permanent feature of adult life. It wasn't a marker of self-awareness. It wasn't pushed on the population as if somebody should always have somebody to talk to. It was not normalized, celebrated, or morally sanctioned as the responsible thing to do. Other things existed in 1994. We had no depression epidemic in children in 1994, none. Pediatricians were not prescribing psychiatric drugs to children. In fact, the idea would have been considered predatory. When someone visibly struggled, attention went to them, like the circumstances in which they were in, trauma, loss, conditions that would bring a normal and expected person to like real difficulties, but it was the circumstances. In 1994, Kurt Cobain died, and he was the lead singer of Nirvana. He was kind of a defining voice of a generation's disillusionment, and the music, the grunge culture was really, um, you know, it, it really achieved a certain level of popularity with Nirvana. And what I remember, because I believe it was in like April of 1994. I could be wrong on that. It could have been 93. But in that era, Kurt Cobain died. And I remember the conversation that followed had nothing to do with brain chemistry or some untreated, mental illness. It was focused on the circumstances of his life. I think he had a chronic pain, a drug addiction, kind of a man who never reconciled, what it meant to be famous. I think it was really challenging for him. A number of interviews reflect on that he went through periods where he just really, really struggled. And we referred to it at that particular time as the causes that were leading somebody to feel that way. And they were discussed from a pro-human perspective. Like nobody at the time was suggesting we need a better prescription drug for mental illness, and that would have saved somebody's life from suicide. Now, at that point, SSRIs existed. So Prozac was coming into the cultural zeitgeist at that time. But it was presented a bit differently leading up to 1994. It started this process of trying to communicate to the American public that you can take a pill and you can change your disposition. I remember there was a Newsweek cover, but it still was not something that was widely discussed. You kind of othered it, right? Like you would think of someone who was really depressed or suicidal to be something of a rare condition that was almost always in the aftermath of something horrific, like a traumatic event. For men, it often was like a loss of a job and not being able to take care of your family. Like there were events that led to why someone would feel this way. But now this shift was happening where you started to communicate it in terms of a medical illness, and that there's something wrong with specific brain chemicals, and you would take this drug and it would somehow correct that. But the idea still at that time was if you handed these drugs to someone who was grieving or anxious or moving through the ordinary darkness of human life, you would have understood it as a fundamental misreading of what that darkness was, right? To provide them to children would have been rightly viewed as predatory and inhumane and abusive. Like you just would not do that. And that understanding was common sense. So the accumulated wisdom of people, who had, watched human beings suffer and recover across generations without a prescription or a mental health industry was the typical. But it became systematically dismantled in a period of time where I moved, into college, into early adulthood. And it was a dramatic shift. And that started with often that direct to consumer advertising, right? You had that famous Zoloft commercial, a small animated figure moves through a gray world, kind of hunched over, disconnected, unable to engage with the people around it. And the color was drained from everything. And then you take the pill and then the world is saturated with color. The figure straightens, becomes a person who walks a dog in the morning light, laughs with friends, returns to the life that was waiting for them on the other side of the prescription. And the message was very simple and it was very deliberate. What you are feeling has a name, and it's depression. And now it's a medical condition, major depressive disorder. And it's a serious medical condition. And like all medical conditions, it requires a medical solution. So you go see your doctor. And what the commercial did not say is that depression is not a medical condition in any meaningful sense. The diagnosis comes with a checklist, not a biological test, never been. And pushing it on the American public as a disease is an invention, a creation. And the suffering it claims to describe as something that has been part of the human experience. And I know what the other side always says is, no, there's another form of depression. It's completely biological. It has nothing to do with a person's circumstances, and it certainly has nothing to do with anything outside of something chemical or genetic. And that messaging continues today, yet we have never been able to identify who that person is, how they get better. There's no predictive aspect of the science that says, okay, we have a population and they're going to respond to an SSRI drug. And there's reasons for that, because an SSRI drug is not targeting the problem. It has nothing to do with brain chemicals, which they're trying to target, which again is a whole body system, right? Like when you take a pill that's targeting serotonin in some way, it's not like it's just impacting the receptor cells. It's impacting your entire body. But you cannot prescribe a pill for a broken relationship, for the loss of a job, a dream, a person you loved, for grief, the uncertainty that comes with illness, the emptiness that comes with modern living. And as I've been saying for so long is, yes, there are medical conditions that have a symptom of fatigue and low mood, but those would be a medical condition that needs to be targeted, whether it is your endocrine system, nutritional deficiencies, or just a lifestyle where you're no longer connected to nature. The predictable consequences of those would be to be miserable. All of those things, it can affect your mood. And what these psychiatric drugs have done, all they have done is muted the signals. But mostly the people who are being prescribed these drugs, they are being prescribed these drugs for the weight of being a human being. Anxiety, sadness, emptiness, small periods of time that are normal. All of this started when they started telling you to see your doctor. And the instruction worked because the American public had been conditioned across generations to receive that as wisdom. American medicine was the medicine of the post-war era, the heroic enterprise that had cured polio, eradicated smallpox, developed antibiotics, transplanted organs. Was this stood as this gleaming proof of American scientific supremacy? The physician was the local face of that achievement, and the white coat, which carried the full weight of institutional authority, kind of was built on that story. And healthcare was much different, right? You would think that healthcare was the restoration of health, identifying the root causes of disease, but no. It evolved to disease management, prescribing of drugs, and we were led to believe that this is medicine. The reverence to your medical doctors should have come with a degree of skepticism, right? Because we have a fairly long history of medical mismanagement and errors that are often have to do with the use of novel treatments and pharmaceuticals, drugs being pulled from markets, and trying to intervene into the natural aspects of healing. We've moved completely away from understanding natural cures because, of course, they can't be patented and they've been suppressed purposely, and we've lost the idea of the human being being in alignment with nature. What we've seen, obviously, is a sicker and sicker population. This is a country that spends more on healthcare than any nation in human history and has the worst health outcomes of any developed country. American life expectancy has declined. More than half of American children carry a chronic disease before they reach adulthood. We're dealing with obesity, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, pediatric cancers, all rising at astronomical rates. The standard American diet, which is manufactured by the same corporate apparatus that produces these drugs, generating the conditions the drugs are then prescribed to manage. Right? You make Americans sick, you develop a sick care industry. Its chronic disease epidemic is the harvest of the same system the public has been taught to revere. And that conditioning is very, very hard to undo, as you saw during COVID. So we've walked into our own cages. We've become enslaved by the authority bias. But so much changed, in this period between 1994 and 2005. The pharmaceutical industry, they became one of the largest advertising spenders in American television history. So networks that accepted those dollars did not investigate the claims behind them. Journalists worked for organizations that could not afford to lose that revenue. So the message, it played in our living rooms and our waiting rooms during the evening news, between segments on morning television. It really has been inescapable. And all these drugs are presented as advanced technology. It was not balanced by any other competing message. So there's no advertisement for, feeling your way through, for the hard conversations, the long walks, the passage of time, what it means to be a human being. The only message with the budget to reach anyone, everywhere, all the time was the one that always ended up seeing your doctor. And that has been the cage that we have walked ourselves into. By 2023, we just see a large percentage of people taking prescription medication for depression. And this is only for depression. Women at over 15%, just for depression. Okay. The rate of antidepressant use across the population increased by nearly 400% between the 1990s and mid-2000s alone. Among adolescents and young adults, between that critical period of 12 to 25, the monthly dispensing rate increased 66% between 2016 and 2022. And of course, we saw after the pandemic, things accelerated sharply. Now, so these numbers only reflect self-reported use for depression. But antidepressant prescriptions become dispensed across all these indications: anxiety and sleep and pain, menopausal symptoms, a range, of course, anxiety. So the true number of Americans with these drugs in their bodies on any given day is almost certainly higher than those published figures reflect. And these are not the numbers of a condition that was always present, finally being identified, and then treated successfully. They are the numbers of a market that was created and then supplied. On my Substack, I wrote an article around the historical nature of depression. Now, depression being something that is severe, you're one that really incapacitated somebody. Sometimes, people have been, so depressed, it was hard for them to work or to take care of their family. We're not denying that. What I'm saying is we don't intervene with what causes that. And there's a natural aspect of being human that can lead to that. But that's less than 1% of the population pre-World War II. Like the generations that preceded ours, there's always been life challenges. So the Great Depression, 2 world wars, high infant mortality, the sustained threat of nuclear war. Those hardships have been there, but people just didn't identify as being clinically depressed. So what changed was not the human capacity for painful emotional states. What changed was the story being told and the machinery built to deliver that story to everyone, everywhere, without interruption. And that machinery was so much bigger than commercials. The commercials were just a public face. The pharmaceutical industry, what they built in the years following 1987, it was so much more than a marketing campaign. It was an infrastructure of influence that reached into every institution capable of shaping how human beings understood themselves. They hired academics from the most prestigious universities in the country Harvard, Columbia, Stanford, Johns Hopkins. And those names carried the full weight of scientific authority in American culture. And those people were retained as consultants, paid speakers, thought leaders. And so most of them were not corrupt in the simple sense, because I think they believed what they were saying. But they were saying it on a platform built and paid for by the companies whose products they were evaluating. So there becomes a clear distinction between independent scientific opinion and sponsored advocacy. Now, these same people, they wrote the textbooks, they trained the next generation of clinicians, they sat on the editorial boards of journals that published the research, they served on FDA advisory committees that approved the drugs. The same names were appearing everywhere, and they made a lot of money doing it. And then before you know it, the pharmaceutical sales representative becomes a permanent fixture in the physician's office. Young, trained, armed with samples and carefully selected data. They arrive in waiting rooms across the country, and they cultivate these relationships with those who hold the prescription pads. They buy them lunch, they buy them gifts, and they bring one side of the story that has many sides. So physicians, who had trained for quite some time to try to exercise independent judgment, found themselves making prescribing decisions inside a relationship that had been engineered at a significant expense to produce exactly the decisions the pharmaceutical companies want them to make. Most never recognized for what it was. This was influence. It was structural. It doesn't feel like corruption. It kind of feels like education, right? So they sponsor all these continuing medical education seminars. They think like they're becoming better doctors. But pharmaceutical companies, they funded the trials that generated the data that published in these journals. They employed the statisticians who analyzed them. The studies that showed any positive results were published. Those that did not were buried. There was systemic fraud. All of this is documented. Publication bias is real. And when you really look into the benefits at all, and remember, the benefits are only determined by a carefully constructed outcome measure. That's a symptom checklist. Even then, right? Irving Kirsch, he's a psychologist. He obtained those complete trial data for antidepressant drugs through the Freedom of Information requests, not just the published data, like the complete data, including the trials that were never published. Again, he finds that the placebo response accounts for the majority of the measured antidepressant effect. So the published literature is just not an accurate representation of what is true. And you see this today when the bureaucrats in Washington start talking about these psychiatric drugs, they're still believing that the evidence, to some extent, supports its use in a specific population. It's way too big of a problem right now. Way too many people are on SSRIs. Way too many people are taking psychiatric drugs. You can't, from the government level, come out and say, we've scammed you. Maybe not intentionally. We went along with the industry. It's just way too much of a problem. What it would do to our economy, my goodness. So what they're doing right now at the government level is they're saying, hey, we need an off-ramp. People are waking up. People are realizing it. There's podcasts like this. So we need an off-ramp. And boy, if you just stop taking these drugs, you're going to be in the worst withdrawal. Some people are on 3, 4, 5, 6 drugs. This polypharmacy nonsense. Like, this is healthcare. Drug. And you get a sicker and sicker population. You're just now managing a chronic illness, which was probably just supposed to be a period of time where you were struggling and you needed some support and to work your way through it. I always get frustrated when I start reflecting on this history because way too much of our population is under the brainwashing. Imagine being born in 1994. You're in your 30s now. You don't know any different. All you know is what healthcare became in your lifetime. Drugs, vaccines, altering who you are at the most basic level biologically. And the full range of emotional experiences, even in your school, your public school life, was talked as mental illness. So we were not exposed to the wisdom passed down from elders and generations and stories, the Stoics, philosophy, how to respond to adverse events in your life and to grow through it, to see it as transformational. And you most certainly were not exposed to cross-culture and indigenous populations of understanding what emotions are as energy, naturopathic and natural cures. You didn't understand yourself to be integrated with nature. You understood yourself to be separate from nature. In fact, in a war with nature, in a war with germs, in a war with disease, in a war with plants and animals and cancer, and everything is militaristic. And when you make it militaristic, you live in a chronic state of fear. You're told that your potential disease that will end your life is genetic, so outside of your control. So this genetic determinism, which drives you to preventative medicine, so more intervention. Again, constant state of fear. And fear, even at a low level, is known to put the body at dis-ease. And that's exactly what we have, is a diseased population. An entire generation absorbed this stuff not as ideology, it's fact. Like the way you absorb the rules of grammar, without being taught that the rules exist, without being told that somebody wrote them. They came for children, right? They came for the youngest customers in this 1994 to 2020 era. Like public schools became the referral pipelines. Teachers with no training and no mandate to question the framework they were handed became like the first point of diagnosis for an entire generation of children. So a child who can't sit still in a plastic chair, sitting under fluorescent lighting, eating poison, was not a child poorly served by an institution. They had ADHD. The sad, withdrawn child struggling with something at home, some of those times very serious. They did not have the same adults that understood it in that context. Instead, they were provided a referral. And that referral is always through the pipeline of the medical system, always through your pediatrician, which then you get stamped that label. Maybe you get sent to a school counselor, but that person too is referring you to a pediatrician or to a therapist right into the system. And then Hollywood, right? The diagnostic language enters the shows, the movies. Characters are written as unstable without their medication, unpredictable, dangerous, transformed by a pill. He's off his meds became a cultural shorthand that required really no explanation because everyone knew what it meant. That's how strong the pharmaceutical advertising was. And these psychiatric diagnoses became the language of a generation. Personality disorders, trauma. I have this. I have bipolar disorder. I have PTSD. I have. So these are no longer descriptive labels of the human experience for billing purposes. Now they're disease states. And they come with an identity characteristic. Now they define you, and they're used as a way to filter out everything you see your life through. If you want to know how you have a mental health epidemic, this is how you generate a mental health epidemic. Moodiness becomes bipolar. Shyness is social anxiety disorder. The loss of anything, right? A relationship, death. If it becomes longer than what the manual says is appropriate, shifts into a disease, apparently. The ordinary difficulties of adolescence, the turbulence, the identity confusion, all the emotional shifts and changes became a cluster of diagnosable conditions, right, requiring professional intervention. In fact, you have a generation of parents who are scared, so they need professional oversight. Everyone's adopted this language. And you know what? If going back to how I started this podcast with how do you create more and more customers? Well, early intervention. So that strategy, it tied it all together. Identify the condition before it worsens. Screen children. Catch it early. Right? It sounds logical, right? Especially when you've been pushed genetic determinism. But really, it functioned as a recruitment chain. Early intervention to early diagnosis to early medication to a customer for life. You know, the child placed on a psychiatric drug at 8 grows up with a system organized around that drug and an identity built around that diagnosis. And a medical record that's going to follow them into every appointment that they have. Oh, you have mental illness. No, you don't have mental illness. You were drugged since you were 8 years old. This creates the long-term revenue stream. Okay? Of course, the internet evolves during this time. And it really closed the gap on all of this because now you have discussion forums organized around diagnoses, patient advocacy organizations funded by the pharmaceutical manufacturers, news cycles that are shaped by the press releases, information that looks like science and education really is functioning as advertising. And then Google, these search engines, through search engine optimization and financial resources, you get to be on the first couple pages of a Google search. This is how you brainwash a population. Like, you think that putting in a question in a Google search is going to make you some expert when all that you're doing is receiving the curated information for you to get you to think about yourself and your life in a specific way. Smartphone obviously completes the whole thing because now this messaging lives in your pocket. Like, it's the first thing that everyone reaches for in the morning. It's probably the last thing they touch at night. And an entire generation grew up with this, and they don't even understand all the money that is put into these algorithms to try to sell this to you. So now, I mean, what starts in 1994 is rare. Someone's diagnosing themselves on a Thursday afternoon, arriving at a clinician's office, already knowing what they have. They just say it to a therapist or a pediatrician, and then the diagnosis and the prescription flow from that. And I think this is what I want to have you leave with today. Because we have to think about what's been lost. So a generation that grows up inside this world has already been conditioned, reshaped. They never received an alternative framework. They received all of this as reality. So the language of diagnosis and understanding your internal states as diseases is a reality for them. They don't know anything different. And many of them started entering into graduate programs and training hospitals and licensing pipelines. They never encountered a set of ideas to be examined. They just encountered the confirmation of what they've already been told to believe. And they've lost this critical understanding that only generations before them would remember, that our emotions are our most sophisticated guidance system. That fear and anxiety is information. Loss is the price of love. Anger, rightly understood, is a signal pointing to something that probably matters. The full range of emotions come in polarity. We love, and with that comes loss. There is fear in this life because we do become spiritually disconnected and we think everything is about this life. We have a survival brain. All this is normal. And we've stripped people of a lot of the meaning of this journey of life. You know, the hero's journey, the struggles, the growth, and the wisdom that comes from that. It's not part of the cultural narratives anymore. You certainly don't learn that in public school. Instead, they develop nonsense like emotional literacy, social emotional learning. Right? None of this is ever meant to be some skill you can absorb from a teacher or a YouTube video. It's meant to be learned in the way everything essential is learned, through experience, through failure, through the people around you who had already been through it. That capacity to feel what you feel, to name it honestly, to allow it to move through you without judgment, to learn from it rather than escape it without judgment. This is what it means to be fully alive. And this is what produces empathy and what builds genuine connection between people, what makes it possible to sit with another person in their pain. But the more isolated we become, the more dependent on technology and screens, we lose sight of that human experience. Resilience was never meant to be a program you go through in 8th grade or a protocol or an evidence-based intervention. It's what's happened when you observe somebody older than you. In a best case scenario, a family member moved something like really challenging with a degree of dignity and growth and learning. When a community gathers around people who are struggling, and you don't call it a disorder, when you read books, and in that literature, you're provided a language for the experiences that have not been yet named in the video game you're playing or the movie on Netflix you're watching, because the naming itself becomes an understanding, and it allows you to see your reality from a different perspective. No, we are mass propagandized. So much of saving humanity is going to be breaking free from this transhumanist nightmare that we have been on since that period of time, 1994. I'm not saying, I don't want to sound like a typical older person from another generation who says, get off my lawn, or make some judgment about, the earlier generations. I don't think that's what this is. I think this is a crisis, a civilizational crisis, where we're losing people to synthetic chemicals, sickness, illness, mass propaganda, and attached to a supercomputer. Like, we're losing our own humanity, and the psychiatric and mental health industrial complex is on the front lines of this. How can it be done where we can wake up? This is what I am most interested in. How do we wake up and try to remember what it is like to be human again when we have been subjected to such propaganda and mass manipulation and control? I mean, can it be done where people can walk out of the cage and move away from their screens and back into building communities, connection to nature, fight for medical freedom and food freedom, like where you can actually eat food that doesn't have poisonous chemicals on them? I mean, I see the awakening. If anything from this mental health summit, it is not necessarily looking for government to solve your problems. I hope that's not what people are doing, because you're giving a group of people power that they don't have and should never have had. But you start pushing this into the matrix, right? So people are on social media platforms, and now you're seeing this on a wider scale. You're seeing people in positions of authority pushing a different narrative. Now, of course, the media that has been funded by those pharmaceutical companies is going to attack such things, or you're taking your medicine away. They're going to push all people into the matrix, or saying, don't take away my antidepressant, it saved my life. And again, the answer is not to take away any drug that a person chooses to have. This is the free will. This is about an honest discussion about what those drugs are and what they're not. If you take that drug and you've been provided factual information about what that drug does, and you choose it anyway, I have no problem with that. I don't agree with that lifestyle. I think you're creating more harm. I think there's safer alternatives. I think there's a healthier way of living. I think that when you suppress emotions, when you blunt yourself emotionally, you're going to have a range of health effects. You're going to have a range of negative emotional effects. I don't think going through life sedated and emotionally blunted is a better life. But again, you have that choice. That's where freedom is. That's where free will is. It can be so disorienting to awaken to this because you realize a lot of your thoughts aren't your own. They've just been told to you since you were born and you don't know anything different. So to question it seems like heresy. But the person who begins to see this framework clearly, who recognizes that what they were handed was not medicine, but a managed reality designed to keep you dependent, compliant, and disconnected from nature and your own intuition, once you start awaking to this, then you become pretty dangerous to the system who really does benefit from you being drugged. And I know there's probably mental health professionals out there who are listening to this potentially for the first time and you think this is nonsense. This is crazy talk. And of course, you've never once really examined the depths of what these drugs do and how they were brought to market and the history. You're just told they were medicine. And medicine comes from doctors. And doctors are in the healing profession. Doctors are really smart. Folks, the mental health industrial complex is not a healthcare system. It's a control system. The drugs, they're weapons. The diagnoses, they're chains. I hope my book, which incorporates a lot of post-material science and things that are just not part of the matrix understanding of how human beings heal and overcome challenges. I hope my book helps illuminate to what is possible. Because the mental health industrial complex and the way that it's currently designed has to be reconstructed in such a way that you can't even remember or it can't resemble its previous self. It's hard, right? Especially if your entire financial salary, your lifestyle, how you take care of your family is dependent on how you were trained. Imagine how threatening this is. And this is the uncertainty of what we're walking into with this future, with AI, technology. They know that many of the professions that we relied upon to serve people are not necessary anymore. What does that do to society? What does that do to the systems? Like, we're going into a very, very disruptive period. That's why a lot of my time right now is speaking with people building alternative systems, because I am interested in what happens in the aftermath of all these disruption. Like, we all should be. How do we flourish? Because I think we're at the end of a dark period. We're at the end of a dark period in human history where much of civilization and humanity has been under this web of dark influence and control. If you're listening to this, do you really believe we elect the president of the United States or our lawmakers? That they're not just puppets that are placed there for us? Actors? Like, if you don't know that yet, you will. I mean, I think one of the things the Epstein files and that intricate web of influence, control, manipulation from the most powerful people in the world, what that reveals is that this two-party system, this idea of a representative democracy, that we have some influence in how our tax dollars are spent, is all an illusion. Right? Who feels good about funding foreign wars, death, destruction, disease? Who feels good about your tax dollars being wasted? Who feels good about a financial system that has slowly siphoned off money from the majority of Americans into the top 1%? Who feels good about how much it costs at the grocery store? Who feels good about having to put your kids in daycare because it requires two parents to have to work? Who feels good about the student loans? Mostly for a degree that doesn't serve you. Who feels good about where we are emotionally? Who feels good about our medical system or our sick care system? By all indications, and I think our emotional states and our physical well-being are the best evidence of cultural thriving. We are not a thriving culture. We're a sick culture. So all these symptoms, all these struggles, they are signals for us where we require change on the individual level, but on the larger collective level. And it starts with regaining our sovereignty. If your consciousness is enslaved, and I know that sounds like a hyperbolic term, but when you can't focus, when you can't sit in silence for a couple minutes, which is a large part of the American population, it's not because you have ADHD. It's because your attention has been captured. It's been captured by this technology about stimulation. You can't really sit and connect deep within you to even understand yourself at the soul level. You're constantly distracting. Phone, Netflix, media, sports, work. You're busy, busy, busy. And your attention is captured. And so many things are influencing you at a subconscious level. So this dis-ease that you're feeling, on a low level, you just don't feel at peace. This is a consequence of all of this. And it has been pushed really aggressively from this time period that I discussed, over half of my life. I mean, I certainly am getting old enough now that I remember a time without these phones, without the internet and without the medical system and the mental health system the way it is. And so I hope that an episode like this is just a little bit reflection of what has been done over the course of 30 years. It's up to us, not government. It's going to be us at the individual level. The parent whose school system is forcing them to go get an evaluation from a physician who's going to do nothing but give you a checklist. You have to resist it. We're starting to see the growing homeschool movement. We're seeing the push for food freedom and attempting to get high quality, organic, whole foods from local farmers. But not enough. Most people are still under this mind control. And I don't want people to think that you have to wait for the government to make some declaration about a particular drug to make it real. Because common sense is going to tell us that a lot of things that we've been brainwashed to think are only serving industry. And there's a darkness to the origins of that industry. Eugenics, population control, and now transhumanism. I think so much about my platform moving forward. I have some exciting things to reveal as we get closer to the summer, is about helping people recognize the cages that they have walked themselves in and making sure there's a path on the way out. right? That's kind of the shining the light. It's dark in there. It's dark. You got stuck, right? You're not living the life that your soul was meant to live. And now we're sick. Now we're in fear. And we're addicted to technology. And trust me, the answer is not going to be the transhumanist agenda. There's going to be no upgrading of the human body through technological interventions, brain interventions, changing your genetic code, trying to alter your DNA. All of that is a trap. It is a trap to alter the human being. It's got a dark history and it's documented. So I want to thank everyone for listening to my rant here today. But I hope you reflect on a little bit of the history on how something like this happens. And I know it's great to applaud the fact that the US government, on some small level, is starting to recognize the dependence epidemic and the over medicalization problem. But remember, the talking points are going to be the same. They're still going to say there is a population that requires these drugs. There's a responsible way of administering them, which anyone who's suffering is going to believe it's them. Right? The system is not designed to discriminate. It's designed to quickly write a prescription. That's what doctors have become. They become drug dealers. And the results are a more dependent, sick, compliant populace where our government can do whatever they want and you're not going to have a revolution. You can start any war. You can do anything you want with your money. They can target the innocent, and they do. They can use every avenue of law enforcement to target dissenters, and they do. And they can continue to use public schools and media to propagandize the American population, all while we become less independent, less sovereign. The fight is for your consciousness. It started when they could use media and other forms of media and public schooling and education to begin to distort what it means to be human and to elevate medical authorities, government authorities, leaders of industry to be the authority. And the new earth that arises out of this darkness is where people are going to realize that the ultimate authority has nothing to do with the principalities on this earth. It's you and your divine connections, and that you're a soul and you're an eternal being. And you come here for a journey, and that journey is meaningful. But the more you become disconnected from nature, and the more you get attached to this one life, the more miserable and consequently more dependent we become. Thank you.